I want to give you some sense of what the original language of Sima Qian's account of Qin Shi Huang's tomb is like. So this is the famous account from the Shiji chapter 6 of Qin Shi Huang's tomb and burial. So I'll be reading it in the original classical Chinese, and then you will see the translations in English keyed to the original text. 9月，葬始皇骊山。始皇初继位，传至骊山，即并天下，天下徒宋义70余万人。传三权，下统而治国。公官百官，戚戚珍怪，习藏满之。令将作记录时，有所传进者，则赦之。以水银为百川，江河大海，记上官署。上居天文，下居地理。以人有高为主，度不灭者救之。20曰：先帝后宫非有子者，出言不义，皆令从死，死者慎重。葬祭以下，或言公长为祭，葬皆知之，葬重祭谢，大事毕，以葬必中言，杀外言门，尽必公长葬者，无复出者。树草木以象山。So let's take a look at the archaeological remains of Qin Shi Huang's necropolis at Mount Li. Here we see a photo from a neighboring high hill that shows what the man-made mountain looks like today, covered in trees, you see here in the middle distance. And here is a picture from close up as you come into the gate of the current tourist establishment here at Qin Shi Huang's tomb mound. You see that today there have been built steps that you can climb all the way to the very top of this tomb mound. Here we see an archaeological plan showing the layout of the entire necropolis of the first emperor of Qin. Now, the necropolis itself was meant to be a microcosm of the entire empire, his palace, his inner sanctum, but also the entire world. And we can see that it was really built to exactly mirror a palace. We have burials of rare animals that represent the imperial zoo. There were side halls where provisions were made for kitchens that would make the emperor's food for his sacrifices, places where his clothes were kept, the imperial stables buried with hundreds of real horses. And so we see that terracotta army pits are just part of a large complex which represents the eternal palace and empire of the first emperor of Qin. The central part of the burial complex is the tomb mound itself. It's a man-made mountain formed by heaping up earth on top of the tomb itself, which is subterranean. The mountain used to be much taller than it is today, and here we see a picture from the early 20th century taken by Victor Segalin, showing that the mound once had a more stair-step-like appearance. It's probably lost about 40% of its height due to erosion. Surrounding the tomb mound are two rammed earth walls, inner wall and outer wall. and these have certain gates through which access could be achieved. This exactly mirrors the layout of palace gates, inner gate and outer gate. And it's interesting to see which groups of figurines are found within the inner wall or within the outer wall, showing how close the emperor perhaps wished to consort with these individuals. To the west of the outer wall of the complex, at the site of Jiaobei Hucun, were found mass burials of forced laborers. And here we see at the left a sensationalized painting from National Geographic showing the Qin supervisors watching over the sweating, back-breaking labor of the conscripts, convicts, and slaves who had to build this complex. Now, this mass burial may contain thousands of dead bodies. Many of them have epitaphs scratched onto pottery fragments, tile fragments, laid on top of their chests. And here we see a rubbing of one of these epitaphs at the right. And they list the individual's name, their native place, and also what their crime was that led to them being sent to this site. This particular individual was working off his debts. And, of course, having debts to the state resulted from fines for theft and minor infractions, but it was a very serious penalty because you could die in a labor camp working off your debts at the rate of 8 coins per day, only 6 coins a day if you couldn't provide your own clothing and food. Now, the number 4 here, just to the west of the main tomb mound, was the find location of 2 bronze carriages. These are half-life size, and when they were found, they looked like this, basically crushed into potato chip size fragments by the weight of the earth that collapsed above them. Now, there are actually 2 different types of carriages from this find, and it took quite a number of years to weld them back together into their original shape. The one on the right is a military chariot, as you can see from the crossbow sitting in the support at the front, and even the reins of the horses were made from dozens of plaques of bronze all chained together. The carriage at the left was known as a carriage for warming and cooling. It was a sleeping carriage specifically for the emperor. The outside was originally all painted. It's pulled by a 4-horse team. This is the kind of carriage that the emperor would ride in his tours around the empire. Now, the location of these 2 vehicles just to the west of the tomb mount is quite indicative that they were used for the soul of the emperor to tour his empire or the cosmos when he decided to leave his tomb. They're located just next to the gates in the walls that surround the tomb. In recent years, archaeologists have discovered a number of new pits surrounding the tomb mound of the first emperor. Here, outside the inner wall, but inside the outer wall, was found a pit of entertainers, storytellers, jugglers, acrobats, strongmen, the kind of people that the emperor kept in his entourage to entertain himself. They were, of course, kept at a distance, outside the inner wall, but inside the outer wall. Here we see what the pit looked like when discovered, burned and smashed, almost beyond recognition. After reconstruction, we see here possibly a storyteller or maybe someone who was balancing a plate on his finger and spinning it, like a Chinese acrobatic troupe of even today. But the figure which has caused the most excitement is this particular strongman figure. And here we see him from different angles. He has some sort of leather strap connected to his belt through which some kind of pole was probably placed. My guess is this figure would be someone who would be holding up a large metal pole or wooden pole upon which was hanging other acrobats as kind of a large acrobatic troupe. This kind of scene is seen later in Han Dynasty tomb reliefs. Now, this particular kind of sculpture is really unprecedented. The sway in the back, the really naturalistic modeling of the figure is unlike the Terracotta Army figures. And this has prompted some scholars to suggest that this kind of realistic sculpture must have come from the West, possibly through influence of the Greek Bactrian kingdom in northern Afghanistan. But I am not so convinced of this. I think it's possible that indigenous craftsmen could produce naturalistic results like this, depending on the job. Another pit recently discovered just to the south of the tomb mound was inside the inner wall, so very close to the emperor. And here we see the figures found in the condition upon discovery. These appear to have been legal officials or other bureaucrats who worked directly for the emperor to control his empire. Now, upon reconstruction, we can see the figures here were originally painted. Here we see a painted face in the figure on the right, and they're wearing more civilian type of garb. They're not wearing heavy armor or weapons like the Terracotta Army. An indication of their job can be seen at their hip, where we see a seal cord and a seal, or possibly a stone for grinding ink, and also a small scraper or knife used to erase the characters off of wooden slips, a kind of eraser. By just scraping off the top layer of wood, you could get rid of that text. So once again, we see a macrocosm of the whole empire. The officials, the entertainers, even the laborers, everyone who was part of the emperor's world was recreated in this necropolis. Now, a few years ago, there was found another pit just to the southeast of the tomb mound, outside the inner wall, but inside the outer wall. And this pit contained hundreds or even possibly thousands of suits of a kind of stone slate armor tied together with metal thread. Now, no real soldiers were found in these suits, or even terracotta soldiers. And so it's unclear whether these ever could have been worn by real soldiers. They're quite heavy and cumbersome and not very flexible. It's possible that they were a kind of grave offering to the souls of deceased soldiers who were whose deaths were indirectly or directly caused by the first emperor. Or it could be that they were once again equipment for his soldiers in the afterlife and made of a more permanent material which would not decay like the real lacquered leather this kind of armor would have been made of. And here we see a reconstruction here at the left of what a suit of this body armor would have looked like, and at the right what one of these stone helmets would have looked like. To me, one of the most amazing pits discovered in the last couple years is located quite to the north of the outer wall, where it's indicated by this orange box. And what was found here was an underground park in which bronze cranes and ducks and boatmen could take the emperor around in an underground water realm. And this is a model of his imperial park system, where he could go to hunt and to fish and to commune with his ancestors at various shrines that were in these parks as well. And here we have an underground view. We see cranes and ducks lined up around a water channel through which probably flowed real water. And at the right here we see some of the bronze cranes in the condition in which they were found in situ. At the left here is one of the cranes having been reconstructed. These are beautiful naturalistic bronze figures, very realistic. If you look at the crane is eating some kind of worm or grub in his mouth, beautifully painted originally. At the upper left, we see one of the boatmen in the position of rowing the boat so he could take the emperor around his water park. And at the upper right, one of these small little ducks also found at this site, lining this water environment. Then we come to the Terracotta Army pits themselves. The pits themselves are actually located more than a kilometer to the east of the central tomb mound. And this is quite appropriate because the army itself faces east, faces the old enemies of the first emperor, the great 6 states that he conquered. It doesn't appear to be the entire imperial army. It appears to be a kind of elite military guard that would protect the emperor and his soul from attack from his former enemies to the east. The Terracotta Army pit itself was discovered in March of 1974 by local villagers who were digging a well during a drought, and they came upon some broken pieces of the figurines. And when this was reported to archaeological authorities, they cordoned off the site and began an investigation of the site. But the existence of the Terracotta Army was really unknown until this century. There is no mention of it in any historical text, and the account we just looked at by the historian Sima Chen does not mention it at all. The complex of pits consists of 4 different pits, which contain at least 7,000 figures. Excavations have not been completed, so these numbers are just extrapolated based on what's been found so far. Pit number 4 of the 4 Terracotta Army pits was never finished. There are no terracotta figures in it, and even its initial excavation was not really complete. Moving to pit number 3, the small pit here at the left, pit number 3 was probably a mobile command post for high-ranking officers, generals, and middle-level officers. And we see here a plan layout of the figures in this particular pit. There's a ramp down into the pit where the figures could be brought in, where there's a 4-horse chariot, and then an array of officers and guards on either side. Here is a photo taken from above, and you can see the remains of the 4 horses, and the chariot itself is gone because it was made of wood and since decayed. And off to the right, we actually see the condition that they were found in. These figures here were not restored, so that we can see how smashed and truly destroyed they are upon discovery. And then here is a photo taken down in the pit itself. You see here that the floor is paved with tiles, and each figure stands on a plinth, and their hands are held at the ready for real weapons, spears, swords, which were originally held in their hand but were later stolen by the rebels or other groups that burned and desecrated the tomb complex. Pit number 2 in the Terracotta Army complex appears as a mixture of cavalry and infantry and some chariots, and appears to have been some kind of military guard. Here you see a plan from above showing the quite enormous size of this pit. The only areas that have been excavated to date are these test pits that you see in the lighter color. And so by sampling around the pit, they're able to extrapolate how many figures were probably in the pit. So you can see a mixture of standing infantry, some mounted soldiers on horses, as well as real chariots pulled by the terracotta horses. And here is a picture down into pit 2, and you can see many sections are still unrestored, and you see the figures in their broken form that they're first discovered in. Now looking at the back of this column, we see evidence of burning. We see this blackened kind of soil, and this probably shows the rafters that initially held up this underground space having been burned by those who looted and destroyed this complex. So we see here the proof of the destruction of this Terracotta Army complex. Now the pit that most people are familiar with and the first discovered is pit number 1. Pit number 1 was the most fully excavated to date, and there's actually a kind of aircraft hangar built over it to protect it from the elements. Here we see a side-on look as well as a top-down look of Pit 1. Pit 1 contains mostly infantry, soldiers, and horses, but also a few chariots leading the head of columns. There are soldiers here at the front, mostly lightly armored. We could call this the human shield. There are soldiers at the side, some of them looking toward the side, facing the side to protect the flanks. And then we have alternating 4-horse chariot teams followed by columns of infantry and archers. Here we see some of the figures from pit number 1 in the condition in which they were found. At the left we see they were all crushed and tumbled down. This was because they were located in an underground vault, supported by a wooden roof and wooden beams upon which was about 6 feet of soil on top of that. Now, when Xiangyu or whatever groups came in and looted this tomb in around 206 BC, when they came in, they burned these wooden supports, and that caused the huge amount of earth to then crash down upon the Terracotta Army. They were originally also painted as well. We can see on the right some of the figures have come up with the paint still intact, but most of them the paint has either flaked off or was burned off in the initial destruction. So they were originally all brilliantly polychrome painted. Now, some of you might be familiar with a picture like this. This is the picture that most tourists would bring back from the site. Here we see Terracotta Pit number 1, and you can see that it's been excavated about half the way back. All the figures that you see standing were all reconstructed like puzzle pieces from their initial broken remains, and this great hangar over the site protects it from damage from the elements. Now, in the far back of this scene, you can see some small figures in the distance. These are the figures that are currently being reconstructed by archaeologists. As they find bits of heads and arms, they go around and they try to piece these back together into a whole figurine, which can then be placed within the pit itself. Now let's take a look at some of the different classes of terracotta warrior figures found in the 3 major pits. The most rare type, and the tallest, of course, are the generals. Here is a general officer. You can see the tassels of rank and insignia that he has on his armor. This was, of course, originally all painted. The general has very elaborate padding under his armor, and his stature is often greater than the other soldiers. The next class of figures would be the middle-level officers, like this figure you see here, still with quite nice armor, not as many tassels of insignia and rank. And here this one appears to have been holding some kind of spear or sword in his hand originally. These figures are quite interesting. These are the chariot drivers who would be driving the chariots found in pits 1 and 2 and 3, in fact. You can see that his armor is extremely heavy, of this lacquered mail armor all tied together, and that even his hands and thumbs are covered with an armor panel so that he won't drop the reins of the chariot if he's hacked at by another enemy chariot. And the last type of figure I want to look at in this particular slide are the kneeling archers. Notice the flex in the back of the foot, a great pose, naturalistic pose. Now, originally, his hands here would have held a genuine bronze crossbow mechanism set within a wooden crossbow, kneeling at the ready to fire off his charge, while there were probably another group of archers standing behind him firing at the same time from a standing position. Now, the weapons that were originally held by all these soldiers, most of them were looted. Many of the iron ones have decayed to nothing. But there are a few pieces, some exemplary pieces, that did remain in the tomb despite the looting and destruction. This is a beautifully decorated bronze shield. It's unclear whether bronze shields would have actually been used in combat. Most likely they were lacquered leather or wood. This may have just been a dress shield for display, or possibly just a shield made for this burial. Bronze swords and bronze arrowheads were also found in the major pits. The bronze sword at the left carries an inscription which indicates when it was made and which factory unit made it and which government bureaucrats supervised its production. This particular bronze sword shows very little sign of corrosion because it was coated in some kind of material using some kind of chemical electroplating that prevented its decay for over 2,000 years. At the right, we see a cache of arrowheads, probably originally housed in a quiver made of some perishable material. This particular slide shows the sheer variety seen in the heads of the terracotta figures, and I'll get to that in just a moment when I talk about their construction techniques. We see on the left a great variety of hairstyles, mustache types, cheekbones, simulating, it seems, the variety of the ethnic types and ages of soldiers who would have served in this multi-ethnic imperial army. At the right, we see some of the great detail of the hair, of the top knots and braids, and various ways of tying up the soldier's hair. Scholars like Lothar Lederose have brought our attention to the fact that the Terracotta Army soldiers were probably made by sewer pipe workers, supervised by foremen who worked for palace bureaucracies engaged in making tiles and sewer pipes and roof tiles, floor tiles, things like this. This is a sewer drain pipe from a Qin palace site, and these are the legs of a terracotta figure, and you can see the same kind of construction techniques, the same kind of fluting, which is used to make the lower legs of these figures. Now, these kind of figures have stamps on them that show the names of officials supervising their production. And this particular official, whose name was Jiang, worked for the Gongshui, or the Palace Water Bureau, which was this bureaucracy that supervised tile construction and sewer pipe construction. He probably supervised a team of perhaps 10 or 12 potters who constructed these figures. But there's another kind of inscription seen on other figures, and these aren't stamped with these kind of official seals. These are scratched with a needle or some kind of stylus, and these indicate a different method of production and a different organization of production. These particular figures appear to have been made by artisans conscripted from private ceramic workshops from the surrounding area, possibly as far out as 100 kilometers away. On the left, we see an inscription that reads Xianyang Yi, Mr. or Ms. Yi from Shenyang City. And it does appear one of the foremen's names is a female name, so possibly female potters were also working on this project. Now, when you compare the terracotta figures made by the government-supervised factories and those made by the conscripted artisans coming from private workshops, there is some difference in style. The ones made by the private workshops appear to have more variation in height and facial features, and they don't have as much of a rigid kind of stylistic uniformity, which is what we would expect from those from the factories run by the state.